this is Amy Laura Hall, and I am recording responses, not really answers, but responses to a group of students who are tenaciously, bravely continuing in their Doctorate of Ministry program at Virginia Theological Seminary. They were, you, dear people, were gracious enough to read my book during this incredibly busy time, and you took the time to respond to my book with questions. So I am recording my responses, my best responses at this time to your questions, and I will continue to be in conversation with each of you as you wish through email. And if you'd like to post more questions on my Facebook page after I post this video, I am also very open to that. I do want to note at the onset that my Facebook page is completely public, so I don't want anyone to feel any sense of confidentiality. If you post questions on Facebook, they will be public, at least in as much as Facebook is public, which is certainly lots of public. So the book, in case you're watching this video and you are not part of this particular class, but you're interested in learning by video, which is not how I prefer to teach, but that's where we are right now. If you're interested, the book that students in this particular course for the Doctorate of Ministry program, the book that they read of mine is my fourth book. It's called Laughing at the Devil, Seeing the World with Julian of Norwich. And it's with Duke University Press. And you can see the absolutely amazing cover that an artist named Julian Alexander created. I've never met the artist who created the cover, but Duke University Press won a big award for the cover of the book and the design of the book. Let's see if I can find, I just want to give a shout out to the artists who created the book because it really is astoundingly beautiful. For example, here's one of my favorite drawings. In the midst of the book itself, there are little markers, little places where the designers have created a pause. And I think I gave them the suggestion for where to put the pauses, but I didn't tell them what image to put, and I could never have drawn something so whimsical yet obvious in terms of what it is. I just love the drawings that are on the cover of the book and that are in the midst of the book. One thing that might be helpful for me, I might as well go ahead and start responding to at least some of the questions that you sent in your message, in your responses to my book. One of the things I love about the cover of this book, it is intricate. There are particular small things that surround the title of the book, Laughing at the Devil, and they're images of things that I name or that Julian of Norwich named in her own visions, and they include very small things like an ant, like a squirrel, there's a little squirrel, a sparrow. Just right before I started videoing this, a bird came and flew right into the window that's right here, and it seemed to be okay, but I was like, but yeah, sparrows, fragile and tough, hopefully tough. Also the mouse, which is one of my favorite images on the cover. So the way that the cover itself in some ways is a response to one of your questions. One of you asked the question, what does it look like to go about trying to have the kind of perspective that Julian of Norwich had about time and about the sense that nothing will be lost, including my dog, who's now like, anyway, that's my dog. I didn't realize she was back there until she started making noises. So what would it look like to cultivate the kind of vision that I perceive Julian of Norwich to have had? So one of the answers is to catch yourself when you are trying to take a God's eye view of all that is. And so catch yourself when you find yourself attracted to any story, including a Christian story, that purports to take account of everything, everywhere. It's something that I encourage my students, graduate students and college-age students here at Duke, to think about, is to catch themselves when they're trying to say something about everything everywhere, or about any particular group of people anytime, anywhere. So Julian does not write as someone who believes she has the authority to speak about God's view of all things. She's writing in a much more, I wouldn't say humble. I mean, I wouldn't say she's prideful, but she's not writing as somebody without authority. She's writing with a real sense of thinking through carefully what she's seen, but she's not purporting to speak from a God's eye view. She's trying to explain what she believes she received from God in her visions. And so one way to try to cultivate how she saw the world is to catch yourself when you're attracted to writers or thinkers or TED Talks or a particular preacher or a particular moralist or a particular activist. If you find yourself attracted to someone who is purporting to speak about all people at all times, if you can catch yourself, you may have a better chance of cultivating a vision that is much more about small, particular, and infinitely, incalculably important small things, like a sparrow. So one way to think about this, I often teach ethics, not so much in terms of how to think, but in terms of how not to think. So one way to cultivate a perspective that I think is consonant with Julian of Norwich's perspective that God grants her in these visions is to catch yourself when you're wanting to find an all-encompassing perspective on any particular phenomenon. I'll try to answer that more if you have more questions, but I thought that the cover, it's not, here is an account of love for all times and for all people. This is a book for everyone. That's not the way, I hope it'll be helpful to people from lots of different perspectives, but I wasn't trying to write a book like that. And Julian of Norwich, while she receives these visions of God's all-encompassing love, she does not write as someone who is cocksure about anything that is going to pertain to every time, every person. That's not how she's writing. One way to think about this is I received this very helpful note from a student years ago when we were reading Julian of Norwich's Revelations of Divine Love. And by the way, I'm just sorry if you're just coming in on this conversation and you have no idea who Julian of Norwich is. I'll make sure to link to some really helpful links about Julian, when I post the video. But anyway, I'm not going to go into the background of Julian of Norwich. But one student at a certain point when we were studying Julian of Norwich together said that usually when you think about a visionary, the word visionary, it means somebody who can look into the future and help people succeed into the future using some sort of method. It's a very brilliant thing that people who are not obviously, but how do I put this? People who have best-selling books about social problems are too often people who are considered visionaries, and they consider themselves and get kind of catapulted into the stratosphere as people who can cast a vision forward. I won't name names, but there are several who are very popular right now. That, just read their book and you'll be able to shed your racism. Probably not, even if they're making a lot of money off of their workshops. So, Julian was not a visionary in the sense that she was able to look into the future and see in such a way, or look into the past even and see in such a way that she could then pull us towards a different future together. That's not how she wrote. She didn't write that way. And the student noted that she's a visionary in a very different way than the way in North American English in 2020 we think about the word visionary. So if you can find ways that her visions contrast with what's considered common sense today, find ways that her visions contrast with what's popular, and not popular in terms of like, I don't know, like I'm wearing a cute top from a popular store, not that, but popular in terms of what's considered to be wisdom for the ages today. Like, find ways that Julian's visions differ from what you find yourself interested in. And I think that is a way to help yourself cultivate a way of seeing that is more consonant with Julian of Norwich's way of seeing. I noted at the beginning that this book is my fourth book. Julian of Norwich is not the only theologian I read or the only theologian I teach. It's not as if I find Julian of Norwich to be, the theologian that everyone must know. I find her writings to be very helpful, and they've been very helpful to students over the years, my 21 years of teaching at Duke. So that is why I continue to teach about her writings, and why I'm okay with recommending people read this book and read her words. So I'm not trying to say Julian of Norwich has the only way of seeing anything, and she didn't herself write about herself and her visions that way. Okay, I'm going to look at some of your questions here so I don't forget. All right. So, all right. Two different questions here I think I can take together. All right. So one of you has asked why Julian would have asked for her wounds. Why would she have prayed to God to receive a oneness, an atonement at one with Jesus on the cross? So Julian, I'm sure some of you know this, it's in the historical introduction of the Penguin edition of Julian's writings, which is translated by Spearing. So you already know this, most of you, but I'll repeat it again because it is important to note Julian is not unusual in this respect. Some people will make Julian into this incredibly original thinker for her time. There are parts of her writings that are really unique, but this particular aspect of her writing is not unique to Julian. It was not uncommon at this time in this part of England, so at the turn of the 14th to the 15th century, it was not uncommon for people who were, for lack of a better word, people who were intent on their piety, people who were intent to know God better. It was not unusual for them to perceive their suffering as an opportunity to ask God to bring them closer to God by putting them in a likeness, putting them really physically in proximity to Jesus on the cross. And there are all sorts of ways that can go horribly awry, and in all sorts of different cinematic representations of piety. You can see all sorts of different depictions of how that can go horribly awry. But Julian of Norwich was not seeking suffering for its own sake. She was sick, and she was asking for God to bring her into what she perceived, and what was not, it was not unique to her to perceive it this way, what she perceived as the point, P-O-Y-N-T-E in the Middle English, the point in space and time when God was drawing all that is, all that was, and all that ever will be into God's self. That is the point of the cross. So it's geographic in that it's the point that is the cross. It is also temporal in that it's the point in time that is the cross. So Julian is asking to be brought into God's presence by way of her illness to perceive, to feel, to be at that point. So that is what she is asking for. She's not specifically asking to be sick. She is sick. She is what potentially could have been a recurrence of the deadly plague. So Julian of Norwich was about 8 years old or so when the plague, the Great Plague, came through England, Western Europe, a horrific plague. And you can read about this if you want to read more. But she was dealing with an illness that she and those around her could have thought was part of a recurrence of the deadly plague. They didn't know at the time that they'd already lived through the Great Plague. For all they knew, the plague was going to be even greater the next recurrence. So she's not asking for the plague. She's on her, what she thinks might be her deathbed, and she's asking for God to bring her into the point in time that she perceives to be the point in time and space, which is the cross, when God is bringing everything that is close to God. When God is bringing everything that is, every little thing, and that's really important. This is not her perceiving God as bringing everything into a giant whirlwind. She sees God's visions. She receives God's visions. She receives God's visions in ways that are very particular. They're like herring scales, blood flowing like herring scales, unaccountable, but that's not, I mean, herring scales. It's like, we might think that's in the United States, we might be like, herring, well, that's still kind of fancy. No, this is Norwich, England, herring scales. And this is one of my students did a close reading on this word. And I very much am indebted to these insights that students have brought to the text. She was like, herring scales, it's a port city. Herring scales would have been like leaves in the fall in New England. So herring, like flowing unaccountably like herring scales, like flowing down like leaves that you have to rake up. Her visions are very mundane. They're very earthly and very everyday. They're very everyday. Okay, and let's see. I want to make sure I'm getting it right, your question. Gotta put the glasses on. Okay, so one of you asked straight up, and I so continue to ask this question as well. Can we find God in all things, even difficult things like the pandemic? Here's my really unsatisfying answer. I have no idea. And I don't think that Julian of Norwich answers that question. For one thing, I don't know who we is. So I'll tell you my answer. It's not an answer, it's a response. I do not perceive suffering to be an opportunity. It's something that it's something I had to reckon with when I first started teaching Julian. I do not see suffering primarily as an opportunity. And I'm not saying that you were saying that, but I have been privy to students, to forms of Christianity, people in my class who have been privy to forms of Christianity who perceive suffering to be a kind of portal or an opportunity to perceive things in a newly vibrant way. I have not experienced suffering that way, not at all. And so I understand there are people who do experience suffering that way. I have not, and I'm very wary of anyone who recommends that the pandemic is some sort of new insight into something. For one thing, people's experiences of this pandemic are so singular. They have where we are in this world, literally, like geographically, where you are in this world, on this globe, will have a lot to do with how you experience this pandemic. Here in Durham, North Carolina, let's just go with people who work at Duke University. People who work at Duke University may or may not have job security. People who work at Duke University may or may not have childcare. People who work at Duke University may or may not have health care. So how any individual, even if we just stuck with people in Durham, North Carolina in June 2020 who work at Duke University, if we just specify all that, I cannot say something particular about how somebody is or isn't going to be experiencing God. What I will say is that Julian of Norwich has helped me when I am, and I name this in the book, when I am dealing with, when I have dealt with things in the past that seemed absolutely insurmountable. I have perceived Julian to be speaking a word into my life that helps me know that I am found by God. So it's not that I've found God in suffering, but Julian has been one of the writers in the Christian tradition who has helped me know that I am found by God. I hope that response at least makes sense, even if you don't agree with me. I hope I hope my response at least is making some sense. Okay. All right. So there's a whole section in my book where I discuss another writer who writes on Julian of Norwich. He's actually a colleague here at Duke in the English department. His name is David Ayers. And if you're interested, you can absolutely, it's A-E-R-S, David A-E-R-S, and he's written on Julian of Norwich. And it's not that I disagree so much with David's particular reading of Julian. I just have a different perspective on what it is she's answering. So the question, though, that one of you has, okay, so Julian of Norwich writes, actually, if God could be angry, basically she writes, oh, let's see if I can find the exact section. Okay, anger is not one of the words here in the index. Let me see if I can find it. It's probably around page 48. Okay, so I'm just going to read a paragraph from my book here. What I have found as I have read Julian and taught her again and again and again is that Julian does not ignore domination and oppression and the horrors we inflict on one another. She addresses the sins of collective life that gather like poisonous fungi on the underside of domination. Her visions do not deny justice. Her visions redirect us away from a cycle of reinforced order that depends on divine anger and a threat of retribution. And I don't know how to answer this quickly enough that I can actually make this video short enough so that I'm able to post it. I think that one of the aspects of Julian's writing that is really difficult to teach for me, it's been difficult for me, it's been challenging for me to teach Julian in the United States. And this is not necessarily at all where you're coming from with your question, but at least for many people, when I'm teaching Julian, I find that there's a form of neo-Calvinism that is not just within neo-Calvinist churches or Calvinist churches. There's a form of neo-Calvinism that I think has been pervasive in popular forms of Christianity. When I say popular, I mean in like all sorts of different forms of Christianity that are in mainstream media, including like Bill Moyers's specials and such. So, but let me try to explain the particular idea, and that is that salvation has to do somehow with balancing out the order of the universe. And it is not as if that question is really important for Christians, but it's not one that Julian is asking. It's not her primary question. She asks that question and answers it at certain points, but it's because that question is a question being asked by others around her. But her main question, I think her driving question is, how is it the case that God perceives each and every small thing as being brought within God's self in the cross? So it's more a question, I think, one of Julian's main questions is, how is nothing going to be lost? How is it that all of these tiny little things, that some of which are on the cover that this artist has created for my book, how is it that none of these things will be lost? So it's not a question, coming from a position of, it's not a forensic question. It's not a question regarding how the scales of justice are going to be rectified. It's not a question coming from a position of, for lack of a better word, coming from a position of power, coming from a position of being able to rectify something. She's not coming from a position of being able to rectify anything. She's not writing from a position of being able to direct leaders on how to think about retribution, restitution, restoration, reparation, reconciliation, any of those words. She's not writing with those questions about leadership, about policy in mind. And it's part of what some people have found really unsatisfying about my book, is that I'm not giving policy recommendations. Now, I write in bioethics, I write in lots of different fields of applied ethics, but with Julian of Norwich, that's not the set of questions that I find her most interesting to consider regarding. And I'm not saying that's your question, but I think questions about God's anger and God's justice are ones that David Ayers is definitely thinking about. I don't think he'd disagree with me. David Ayers is thinking about justice, and he's thinking about whether Julian addresses the sins, the evils of domination and repression and from her time, and whether or not she's adequate in addressing those. I just think she's asking different questions. She's asking questions from the underside. She's asking questions about suffering underneath a system of domination and oppression, which unquestionably was the case during feudal England. And we could talk about that for a long time, but I won't go into all that. That was a long response to a very important question, and I may have misunderstood the import of your question, but hopefully something I said was helpful there. Yeah, okay, and the next question is very much related. The question of evil. So I have startled people. This question comes up often when I'm giving a talk about Julian. In churches, it came up when I gave a talk at the Chicago institution. So one of the things that I just name it blankly and startle people is the Cheney question. The question is like, what do we do with Dick Cheney? Well, yeah, not the Hitler question. The Hitler question is really important, but for today, because he's still walking around in this world, the Dick Cheney question. So the Dick Cheney question is not a question that Julian asks. It is, again, a kind of question that it's not at all unusual for you to be asking this question. It's a question that that we are given often in an ethics course or in a different sort of a mini series. What should be done about this person who has done horribly evil things? I mean, the simple answer is The Hague. Like, we have an international court of human rights. So the Cheney question has been answered by the United Nations, but Julian of Norwich is not asking, or she's not even, her system, the way, she doesn't have a system, but her writing is not primarily about asking or answering a question about having the opportunity to hold a king or a lord accountable. the serfs, the people who are living in the feudal system and being treated like the people who are being treated as if they are tools, like they're being treated like rakes or hoes or shovels. Those people were, during Julian of Norwich's lifetime, many of them trying to resist through uprisings throughout Western Europe and England. They're trying to resist being treated like they are not human, being treated as if they are not to be counted as singular, as important in God's creation. They were considered tools by many who were above them, and they are resisting this. They are resisting this violently, and they don't have the horses and the giant mace to destroy their enemies. They're resisting people with so much power that they are just being mown down like mice. That's part of what Julian of Norwich, I believe, is writing in the midst of, is what does it mean that people have been brutally killed by the lords and are also counted as immeasurably God's own by God. So there's an edge, I think, to what she's writing, given the context that she's writing in. So she doesn't answer the Dick Cheney question because she's not, what's her name? The woman in Tale of Two Cities, Madame Lafarge? Is it? I'm trying to remember what her name is. In Tale of Two Cities, the woman who is knitting. Slowly but surely, the names of the people who are ultimately going to be on her list when the guillotine is active. Julian is not, she does not have the capacity. That's not where she is. I don't want to suggest that if she had the power, Julian would have been knitting a list of names, but it's the Dick Cheney question is not one that she's writing about. And so, again, if you want to try to cultivate a way of thinking, going back to the first question I had on the list, if you want to try to think about a way to cultivate how to think like Julian of Norwich, then try not to think like someone who has the capacity, power-wise, to determine who should live and who should die. Now, if you end up working at The Hague, then continue to try to, although I'm against the death penalty, but I'm not against international tribunals for justice. Okay. All right, yep. Another question about, yeah, I think it's more a response. The next one was more a response. I am very willing to think about other writings in the past and in the present that help people think about politics, and the word that one of you is using is mysticism. I think that what I'll do is I'm going to give some more suggestions to your professor, Professor Dr. Elizabeth DeGaynor. I think I'll give some suggestions to Professor Dr. Elizabeth DeGaynor about other suggestions for readings, but I will tell you that a video that I really want to recommend is by a theologian who is writing today named Karen Kilby. She's at the University of Durham, England, and I know are doing a whole lot of reading, but there's a short video that you can find online if you do a search for Karen Kilby, 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 on suffering, pain, and loss. That's, I believe, the title of the video, on suffering, pain, and loss. And I think that Karen Kilby may be helpful to some of you as you're thinking about spirituality, mysticism, and politics, and Julian's writings. In terms of interreligious, interspiritual connections with Julian's visions, I am sure somebody's written on this. And I don't know who to recommend at this point, although I will, oh gosh, I'm going to forget her name. Let's see if dang it. I do, just in case you are interested in somebody kind of off the academic beaten track. There is a young adult young adult fantasy writer. I hope I'm calling her by the right term, who's written about Julian of Norwich, who's written some things that some of you may find interesting. Her last name is Valente, Valente. Her first name's Catherine with a C. I think y'all have copies of the book. I quote her on page 4 of my book, and let's see if I name what her blog is called. No, I didn't, darn it. I didn't name what her blog is, but Catherine Valente, her first name is spelled Catherynne, Catherine M. Valente, Valente. Some of you may find her writings helpful as you're thinking about other writings that could be interesting. Yeah, so there are many other people for me to name, but if you're looking for somebody who's not an obvious academic and who has created a really visually interesting, visually compelling, I think, depiction of thinking in ways that are given the way you've asked your question, I'm not going to name your name just in case you don't want your name named, but given that you seem to enjoy having your head spinning, having so many thoughts going on that you're excited to write your next sermon because you know it's going to find its way in somehow, some of what's made your head spin, Catherine Valente may be interesting to you. I found her very helpful. Okay. All right. Okay, so yeah, okay, so one of you notes that Julian took a very long time to write her long text. So we don't know exactly how long between her receiving her visions, her writing her short text, and then her writing her long text. We don't know exactly the chronology of that process, but we do know that she took time. She took time to think and pray and consider. For all I know, she was drawing diagrams. I don't know. We don't know exactly what her process was. But yes, she took a long time to think through what she had seen in her visions. And your question, I think, is primarily about the patience to not have the answers, perhaps. The patience to be willing to take the time to continue asking questions. In this regard, I've written about this in other contexts, but y'all are DMin students, you're students in a Doctorate of Ministry program. Some of what I had to say to students in the licensing program for the Rio, Texas conference may be helpful to you, and Dr. DeGaynor can give you links to those videos. But I will say, I do think that the primary virtue that I've had to practice and cultivate and beg for and pray for and keep trying to learn is patience when it comes to actually teaching real people and caring about their questions. Patience in not trying to find an answer in the midst of this pandemic when scientists are struggling to figure out what is going on, and many of us are trying to find an answer that can be more quickly obtained. That was lovely passive voice. We are wanting to find answers that are quicker than are realistic. We're wanting things to be back to normal. So impatience is a problem for many of us, and I think in ministry, it is the main virtue is a kind of attentiveness to real people and their particularities, and not to jump to judgments about what's really going on in a congregation until you've been there and asked a lot of questions and listened to a lot of voices, not just the usual suspects. So y'all are in the Doctorate of Ministry program, you already know this, but yes, she took a long time. So the form of her writing, it's a small book, and she took a long time to write it. The form of her writing, I think, is a model also for ministry in taking the time to attend. Okay. These are such good questions that I'm not doing you justice. Yeah. So these questions, Dr. DeGaynor put them sort of thematically, so it's not as if your question's the least important, that it's the last one that I'm addressing. It's a very important one, and that is, the question is, how do we be with one another in the midst of this turmoil that is this pandemic? I answered someone else on a podcast about this, and I think what I said there might have been helpful. And I said this months ago. This was months ago. I was in Texas helping take care of my parents. And what I was seeing, so I was in Texas helping take care of my parents. I was far away from my friends. I was going onto social media in part to find out how other people were dealing with this. I was also suddenly teaching 2 classes online, which that's not something I do well. And what I was seeing was that people in my online classes, some of them, not all of them, but some of them, were very reticent to acknowledge to one another that they were struggling during the first month of the pandemic. So like in March or so, I started getting a sense that people were telling me that they were struggling, but they weren't telling one another. And by April, I was really noting that on social media, I was seeing people get so angry with one another on social media and saying things that I wouldn't have expected friends to say. Things like, well, at this rally, and one of you noted this, and I heard this also, I saw this with my own eyes on people I know on their pages. Well, maybe if all these people go to a rally without masks, at least we'll have fewer Trump supporters in existence, or something like that, like this form of like wackadoo social Darwinism. And that I think part of it is that when people, not everybody, but sometimes, I don't want to sound like a TED Talk, sometimes some people, when they are scared, sometimes try to find someone else who they are better than, so that at least they can feel like they're doing something right. So I'll try to give you an example. I found myself doing this, and oh my gosh, when I was in Texas, the only time I really lost it at the grocery store was the people were not keeping social distancing at the only grocery store that was accessible for me to get groceries for my parents. People were not keeping 6 feet apart, especially after most people were wearing masks. It was like, if we're wearing a mask, it doesn't matter. We can like just come up right behind somebody. And I did. I was so worried about my parents. At one point, I just said, 6 feet. It's 6 feet. And like, I actually said that, and like people jumped. I was like, I'm sorry. But I was definitely scared. I was frustrated. I was terrified of what was going to happen to my parents, who were going through medical crises at the time. that impulse, I don't think I'm alone in that impulse. I think for some people, when we're afraid, we want people to remember the rules. And if they don't remember the rules, then maybe they are just not destined to live. That is, like I said, that is one of the things I saw some people saying that I don't think they would usually say such things. So how do we get through this without turning on one another? Doing our best not to try to find someone who is worse than us so we can feel better. The other person, I wrote a close reading on a whole book. So 2 of my 4 books are on two different thinkers. 2 of my books are close readings of one thinker. My first book is a close reading of the work of Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher from the 19th century. And Kierkegaard has a line in his book, Works of Love: to be better or to seem to be better by comparing oneself to the badness of others is, after all, a bad way to become better. So I just want to say that I am not above thinking that way. Like, I'm better than somebody because I've got on my mask and I'm keeping the proper social distance. And I'm homeschooling. I'm not really. I'm homeschooling my dog. But like, I'm not above thinking I'm doing things right and therefore my existence is justified and God loves me more. But I will say that way of thinking, for some people, when we're suffering and we're scared, is especially tempting. So that would be my best answer. Are you licking your foot? Yeah, Brownie. I think she can tell I'm nervous because it's a scary question to answer because I know I'm not gonna get it right. But there is another lesson I can give you, and that is that we're all just doing the best we can right now, at least those of us in the 99%. I'm not sure about the head of Amazon, not sure about some of the other CEOs. I'm not sure that the CEO of American Airlines is doing the best that they can right now, but for most of us in the 99%, we're doing what we can to get through day by day right now. And so thank you for your courage in taking this class. Thank you for your courage and your patience in reading my book. Thank you for your thoughtful responses to my book. And I hope this continues to be a conversation. Bye.